Today we are back in Maya and I want to show you how I'm configuring and setting up my Maya preferences, how I'm setting up my UIs, my workspaces, how I set up my default shaders. I'm showing you everything I know and how I used to work with Maya. Just that you know, these tips are not in order. I just wrote them down as I thought about them. I would recommend you to not skip through them because I'm dropping hints and tips all over the place. So if you just check the first 10 seconds and say, oh yeah, I know that trick, you might miss out. So be sure to check out the whole thing. Also, I want to thank all my patrons for their continued support on my channel and on my Discord server. I really appreciate every one of you. It's really helping me to get going, to get motivated, to get up and do more videos for you guys. So really thank you everyone. I really appreciate it and I can't thank you enough for your continued support. Thank you so much.
Alright, so just that we are on the same page, what I always like to do, I'm just deleting the Maya preferences, and you don't need to delete the whole folder. It's enough if you delete the version number you are running. So I am using Maya 2022. This is right now the trial version, but anyways, you can just delete your preferences like that and make sure they are gone, and then you can just relaunch Maya and you will see that that folder will be recreated with no prefs at all. So this is now the default, and you can see I get this 30-day offers and whatnot. So you can just close these two windows, and then you should be seeing if you want to copy preferences from previous versions, but I'll be just starting with the default preferences, and then you can see Maya is loading up. A question I got asked several times in all my videos is how I set up my UI. Like, what did you do to create this nice, clean, polished look? And I'll be showing you how I set that up. So as you can see, it's very cluttered on default. So my first thing, what I always do, I go to the drop-down menu here on the top right corner, and I go to Rendering Expert. What this will give me is lots of different windows, and you can see I get this tabbed viewport, which is exactly what I want. But important for me is that I can customize this. So first thing what I always do, I right click on the render setup and I close that tab to get the outliner on the left. Then I collapse the script editor. I just tap it and it's minimized towards the bottom, which is perfect. And then for these two panes, what I like to do, I want to keep view pane here. And sometimes what I do dock the script editor on the right, or I dock something else because I don't want to lose this tab view, because if you close the render view, this tab view will not be there anymore. So what I most of the time do, I just open up the outliner, the node editor or something similar, and just drop it up here. So now I have that, and then I can close the render view. And now I still have my both tabs here, which is perfect. The next thing what bothers me is that the tabs for the right hand view on the left, so you can right click them and choose tab direction to the right, and now you can see they are on the right. I always close the attribute spreadsheet on default, and I keep render settings, channel box, UV editor here. What I always do, I open up the auto render view, which is the render view I'm using all the time, and I'm docking this between the outliner and my middle main window like this. And now I have my render view on the left and my viewports on the right. And I can always then say, oh, I want to collapse the render view to have more space, or I can open up my render. And let's say I want to have the hypershade as well with a viewport. Then I go to panels here and say I want to split it or stack it like this. I have two views now, but top and bottom. And then I can just say go to the top one and say, oh, I want the hypershade on the top here. The default hypershade is also super busy. So what I always do, because I don't need all the other stuff, I just close all these extra windows because I'm really just interested in the node view. Because all the rest I can achieve on the attribute editor. So let's say I create the standard surface shader like that. I have everything at my disposal on the right. What is a handy shortcut is Control A, because most of the time I am in the channel box, or actually I'm in the render settings, and then I hit Control A to go back to my attribute editor, change something, go back to render settings, Control A to go back to the attribute editor. And then obviously what I do, I save it as my custom viewport. So save current workspace as rendering custom. That's typically what I always do like that. And now it's stored. Another hidden thing which people are not super aware of is the outliner. And if you have lots of objects, obviously I do not have lots of objects in an empty scene, right? So I could potentially just duplicate a few things and create lots of data in the outliner or in my scene like this. And you can see now it gets really cluttered. So let's say I create a light source or something like that, and now it's at the bottom, right? And now if I do want to move the first sphere, I always need to scroll up, go to the first one, move this one, and then if I don't know where my light is, but I do want to move it, I need to go back down and move the light. So that is sometimes super inconvenient, right? So a cool trick I like to do and show you guys is you have this little dotted line here at the bottom of the outliner, and if you click and drag that, you can actually drag a second outliner from the first one. And the cool thing is you can keep this at the bottom and this one at the top. And then you have essentially 2 in 1, which is super good tip, which I use all the time, especially if you have crowded outliners and lots of things in there. All right, next up, I want to talk about default render settings. I'm not super fond of the defaults which ship with Maya Arnold, so I always create my own custom ones. And due to the scene scaling, you can see that my checkboxes are not fully working, but you can kind of see there is this check mark here. That is because I changed my DPI scale to fit for this tutorial. It's not ideal, but I hope you can see what's happening here. So the most important tab is the Arnold render tab, and my default render settings are most of the time 2, 1, 1, 1, 1. Sometimes for SSS I keep them at 2. Adaptive sampling is a good default how it is. This clamping is also good for my taste. Let's see, that is good. Ray def is good. Sometimes I move these up to 2, but for first pass renders, diffuse on 1 is exactly what I need. Motion blur off, operators nothing, light threshold is good. Textures, I always disable the auto convert. That's me. I like to do it because I want to be in control what is being converted and what not. And I also want to use existing TX textures if it finds them on the disk. Accept unmipped and auto tile is good. Accept unmip, unmip means if this is not a TX texture, it will still kind of render, but it will not create an error. And sometimes if you want to force mip maps, you can have this off. Subdivision, this is the max subdivision. It's depending on what you have set up on your geo. So I most of the time ignore that. Images, obviously nothing. For system, I like to kind of jump between 32 and 64, depends a little bit on your memory and on your final resolution, but I like smaller bucket sizes for faster updates essentially. What I do, I talked about this in previous videos, I have my auto detect threads on default on -20. This is for my system because I have so many cores. I want to reserve quite a few for the system, and this helps a lot to create a nice fluid render, at least interactivity while rendering. This is not affected by final pixel rendering. This is essentially, once you render, it will use Kick and it will use all the cores available. But on default, this is pretty good. What I always do as well, I have my default render size to full HD like this. And I make sure I render in half precision, which is 16-bit. It's not 32. And I want to have auto crop on, and I want to also merge the AOVs. So the AOVs will be merged into one EXR file. And then what I do, I go to presets, and is it presets? Export render settings, and then you have your location where you want to store them as a JSON, and you can just say default custom or something like that. You just save that, and then what you just do, you can set your preferred render settings to default custom, and then every time you relaunch it, you should be running with these settings in the future. Okay, so now we tackled render settings. What I always like to do as well is have my list of default AOVs, Arnold output variables essentially. So AOVs is used in compositing. They are like essentially sections or partitions of your final image. And the default ones are quite straightforward. You always want the direct and the indirect of all the ray types. So you want to diffuse, direct and indirect. Then you want your coat, you want your sheen, You want your specular, your subsurface scattering, your transmission. So you want all of these as your default AOVs, because this will give you the most control in compositing your shots later. And then you can think, if you want to add crypto mats on default, it makes sense to have this actually, because then you will always have IDs and comp to pick them. So you just create the crypto mats as well. And then what I always have is normal P and P ref, and Z for my depth component, and I'll just create those. So this is my typical default list of AOVs. You can see my data passes are set to closest, and it's on float, and this is on vector, which is correct. And so this is a good setup. And then I can go to export AOVs as my default AOV list. Let's say default AOVs like that, and I can just save them. So if I delete all now, what I can do, can go to import AOVs, and I can always just import them, and I always have my default AOV list. All right, so default shaders. Quite a lot of you have asked me why I have different default shader settings. What is my neutral gray shader? Why is it so different than the default Arnold standard surface shader? So what I always do, I create the standard surface material, which is coming in like this with the new defaults of 1, which is good. And importantly, to create a neutral gray shader, you want a reflectance of 18%. So when you go into your rendering space and you disable the color management, so this is now my working render space. If you're in the rendering space, you want to have your neutral gray to be on 18%. What that means, it just tells the renderer this albedo base color is at 18, like 1.8, and it means it will reflect that amount of light back once if you have a light hitting it. So this is my setup. And then for the roughness, I typically go to 0.65 or 0.7 for a roughness, for a rough surface like that. I don't touch the IOR, and I just make sure everything else is on the defaults, which is all turned off. Can just quickly check, but everything is essentially on 0, which is perfect. And what I then do, I go to, actually I do have it saved here already, so I just save this as my standard surface preset, and I'll just call this neutral gray like that. Let's just say YouTube like that, and then I save that. And then what I can do, I can just always just load this up, and I know this is my default gray shader, and you can see that I have also set up a few ones before like that, and I do the same then for the other material. So everyone is super excited about OCIO 2.0, which is now shipping with Maya 2022, which I have installed, which we are looking at right now. So you don't have to do anything anymore. You just install Maya 22 and you have OCIO and ACES pre-configured for you. So if you go to Windows Settings, Preferences, and you check out the Color Management tab, you will see that Color Management is on. You have OCIO configs, Maya 22. Everything is set up for you already. So you don't need to do anything because you have ACES, you are on ACES CG, and your display is on sRGB. And you have your default rules, which is perfect. So this is quite convenient. The only downside with this is using a different config as maybe you have on different DCCs. So I would still recommend, especially if you have Nuke, if you have Katana or any other supported OCIO application, that you probably should do it a little bit different. At least that's how I would do it. And I would recommend you do the old approach. So you download this OCIO config file from the ACES website or the OCIO website and get ACES and install it somewhere. So for instance, I have it installed on my dev color ACES 1.2 location, and you can see this is where my OCIO config file lives. And what I then do, I go to my system variables. You can just search it, just hit the Windows tab or wherever and just type environment variables. And then you can say edit system environment variables and go to the bottom here where you then can create your OCIO variable file. So I have this one here. You can edit that and you can see it's pointing exactly where this is. I just changed the name here and hit OK. So whenever you have this variable set OCIO, Maya will read that and it will be overwritten and it will not have this one in here. As I said, the beauty of this is if you have a global OCIO config file, every DCC will read that instead of the one shipping with your DCC. Sometimes you will have conflicts between OCIO versions, like Maya now shipping with 2.0, where all my others are still on the older version. So that just ensures that everything is on the same page. But again, this is your preference. If you just have Maya, you don't care about all I said right now, and you just use the one which is shipping, which will be perfect in most of the cases. All right, so now let's talk about OCIO rules. And we briefly touched up on that, but if you go back to your preferences, go to color management, you can see that you already have a few rules set up, which is good, but you probably still want to change a few things. Or at least I would recommend you do that. So for instance, you have EXR files, right? So if you have Substance Painter and you export tons of EXR files, you most of the time want your base color to be a different different IDT than your normal maps, for instance. So what I always like to do, I just create a new one and let's call this just base color, maybe like this. And once you have that created, you can say, if base color is in the name and it's extension EXR, then you want to apply maybe a different file rule. So you just click on the default name here when you see the list icon appearing, and then you just pick sRGB. So what will happen now, whenever it finds base color in the name, and you can also say if it's an EXR and it finds base color in the name, then it should be a an sRGB texture, like that. And you can do that for all sorts of things, right? So if you know it's a normal map or you have all these different custom ones, you can just say, okay, let's do a height map, right? Because height map is not that regular. You don't see it that often in other names, essentially. So you can do this as well and say, if I got height in the name, I want this to be a raw file as well. So you can create your custom rules, and whenever you create a new file texture and it has base color in the name, it will actually automatically change the IDT to raw or sRGB or whatever you want it to be. And something which people are not super aware of is that you can do quite interesting patterns in here. You don't have to hard code it like this. For instance, if you want to have, if you don't know if base color is the C is big or small, well, you can essentially do a question mark in here, and the question mark will be replaced by any character. So it could be color or Zoller or color, small caps or upper caps. So this is essentially replacing it to be any character. But if you're sure what it is, you can also do like square brackets in here, and you can say, I want smaller C and a big C, and then it will just replace this. So this is now case sensitive. You can do the same with the B. So you can do square brackets here, and you can do a small and a big B. And now this is very clever already, this little file path. And that way you can create your own custom input strings. So it's very important to have obviously a fixed naming convention in your pipeline or in your little personal project. So make sure that everything is named properly, and then you can make full use of all these automation tips here. All right, and before I start, things I always do, I go through the Maya preferences and see if things can be changed or adjusted. And I always go through one by one. So I'll just do this once so I can always point you to this video so you can see how I'm setting up my system here. So one thing is for the panel configurations. I always save my panel layouts with the file, but when I'm opening them, I am never restoring them from the file, because if other people save their layouts, then I will always restore them from that file. So I don't want that on. And I always want to use this keep the current layout, which is the one I have right now. And then this will, whenever I reopen it, it will keep the current layout, which is perfect. For display, what I always do, I disable the render swatches, because this will internally kick off a render process. And if you have lots of nodes, lots of shaders, this will take a little bit of time to do that. And I don't care honestly for the swatches, so I always just disable them completely. Kinematics, I never touch. Manipulators, never touch. Nips, I never touch. For polygons, I never do anything. Subdivs is the same. Settings, I make sure that I'm in centimeters, and Y is my up axis, that's correct. For cameras, I do change a few things. So for the near clipping, I clip most of the time at 1 centimeter, and then I add 2 more zeros to my far clip, so my cameras are not clipping my view so quick. And I just don't want to have them animated. You can hit animate here so that there's a nice animation once you hit F and frame everything. Color management we discussed. Dynamics is fine. Files and projects. What I do, I always set up my default project directory, and I do have mine on a different location, obviously, which I don't need to show, but I change my default projects directory. And also I always have an R&D project on disk where I always start my Maya session in. Important for me is enabling autosave, so I have that on. I do not prompt, and I limit autosaves to 10 or maybe even 5. And I do have them, depending a little bit on the scene size, I have them quite frequently. So 2 minutes, so every 2 minutes there's a quick autosave. Depends, again, as I said, if your scene is big, it will take a little bit of time to save it. So make sure to use references to keep your scene files small. And then only 10 autosaves, which means that we'll always replace the oldest one with the latest one. You can also pick your OS native file dialog. I sometimes do that, and then you will not get this Maya default one. So if you use the OS native, you get your Windows Explorer if you want to pick file textures and whatnot, and the other one would be the default Maya one. Let's see, file references. I always allow editing for referenced files. This just gives me a bit more flexibility. I never knew really what this is, but I always change this to polygons. This is a legacy thing I always do. Next stuff I don't touch. I always go for the connected mode for my nodes in the Hypershade and node graph. I do have grid snapping on, so everything is nice and straight. I most of the time display the grid as well. For rendering, I have render setup and my default location. This is also something I changed to have a location on disk. It just means whenever I have a user template in my render setup, it will grab them from there. So I have a collection of several template files which they will be picking up. So when I start a new session, I always change these to my global variables. Snapping is fine. Sound I never touch. Time sliders, so that's important for your project. So most of the time 24 is the default film rate, but your phone most of the time has 30 or 60 FPS, so it depends a little what you want to do, but I most of the time keep this at 24. I do change a playback from play every frame, playback by 1, but the max playback speed is limited to my FPS, so it will not go faster than it's supposed to be. And I also want to update all my viewports at the same time, and I want to loop this in a continuous loop. Also, before I forget, sometimes you want to view your texture files or your sequences. So typically, I think it opens your stuff with fcheck, which is quite an old school way of checking your frames. So in your render globals, if you go to the prefs here, at the application level, all the way at the bottom, you can change the default applications to view things. So I have my viewer is called RV. And I all the time use that because it allows you to display layers, it allows you to display and color correct your image on the fly. So I always change this to my RVEXF file as well. I do switch my PSD files to Photoshop. My image sequence viewer is the same as RV because it supports QuickTimes and image sequences. For AVI files and MOV files, I do change this to VLC. So these things I always set up to have a nice fluid way of checking my input files. Next up is the plugins panel. So if I head over to Windows settings, plugin manager, sometimes there are things in here which I don't really use, and I just disable them just because of my startup times. Some things make things a little bit faster than others. I'm not always 100% sure what all of these are. Like Aruba Tessellator, I always try to figure out what it is, but I'll just disable it, and if something is weird, I know I disabled things. Autoloader, again, detection log, I don't know what that is, so I probably just leave a few things. Cache evaluator, I think sounds good. Curve warp, I don't know, don't need it because I'm not doing that much. It's mostly I'm looking for things I use for rendering. So game FBX exporter, also it's mainly for Unreal, I don't use it. Game pipeline, I don't use it. GPU built-in deformer, I'm not really sure either if I use that because I'm not doing any GPU built-in deformers. But again, I know these things exist, so if I need to come back, I totally can just enable them. IK2 is rigging stuff. LookDev kit, yeah, let's keep that. Matrix nodes are sometimes needed for shading. Maya character, don't need it. Maya HK, don't need it. Muscle systems can be ignored. So that's what this is typically very personal to my uses for Maya. So I don't recommend you do just this blindly because I'm doing it. That's just, you need to kind of understand if you disable things here, you might lose functionality of Maya itself. Scene assembly, I don't know. Shader effects, I don't need that. This is mainly for viewport shading with a custom third-party shader. SVG file translator, I don't think so. TIFF float reader, don't know. Type is for fonts, I believe. UFE support is new, I don't know what that is. Unfold 3D is for unwrapping, which I use. ATF plugin, I don't know. Bifrost, yeah, let's just keep Bifrost in here. Let's keep Mesh, let's keep USD, which is new. Rococo motion library, I still want to look at it, so at some point I will bring it back. And then FBX is fine. M2A obviously is Maya. Substance I want to keep. Sweep is also a new thing which I added as a modeling tool. VNN is also, I believe, a viewport shader, and XGen. So this is typically what I always do. And then I'll just hit close and I go to File, Save Preferences, and then I close Maya, and then I finally set it up, and now we can finally get to work.